Well, when I started, it was totally, not totally print. I mean, I guess there was television as well, but uh, around the time I started was a transition time for the big magazines, Look, Life, Saturday Evening Post, Collier's, all of which eventually went out of business, presumably because television could bring those sort of images to people faster than and better, more immediately than they could. Although I sort of missed Life. I liked the idea that at the end of the week, whatever sort of grainy picture you saw in the newspaper, or maybe one you hadn't seen in the newspaper, would be a full page in Life, and you could actually see what happened. But all of these magazines sort of, Life certainly, the one I saw closest up was Life, because I was working for Time then, in the Atlanta Bureau mainly. And they sort of flailed around trying to find various ways to avoid what was really I think, a foregone conclusion. One of the things that I found, I did a book of some years ago on a college classmate of mine who was a sort of golden boy who we all expected to be president. And Life had covered his graduation, and Alfred Eisenstadt had photographed his graduation. And when I went back to look at that issue of Life, I was surprised because I hadn't remembered how many just consumer ads there were, almost supermarket ads for ketchup and Jell-O and things like that. So that whole business has changed, and it's changing again, obviously. The papers, it doesn't seem that long ago when papers were thought of as sort of cash cows. The whatever, I can't remember the wonderful euphemism they had for the legislation that made it possible essentially to have a monopoly in a city, of something like Failing Newspaper Act or something like that. It gave people just sort of a license to print money. And even when they started to get in trouble, they got in trouble even though they were making profits. But Wall Street said they weren't enough. And then unfortunately, many of them decided that the way to save themselves was to cut down on the service that they had. So they cut people who were doing news stories, cut particularly people who were doing stories that took some time. And I think that's the part that's not going to be replaced. I mean, I think that's the really dangerous part. Even though there's a sort of a inside blogosphere kind of culture that leaks stories and has whistleblowers and everything, the reporter spending weeks or months on a story finding out something, I think is soon going to be a thing of the past. And I mean, the statistics you read, some paper, I don't know, I think it was the Philadelphia Inquirer, used to have this many people covering City Hall. Now they have that many, a tiny fraction of that. So their stories are going to escape those few people. They can't possibly do them. And they can't spare those people to work weeks or months on a story. So I think that part's going to change, and I don't think it's a good change. The last person to ask about that is a reporter. Anybody on the editorial side of journalism is usually the last to know about anything. I suspect that the people, when Gourmet folded, who were the last people to know were the people working there. The day it folded, I had a beautifully engraved, thick invitation to a party celebrating the editor's 10th year as the editor. It's always done sort of surprisingly. I don't know. I mean, I guess somebody's going to figure out how to make money out of the internet, and maybe niche magazines. I think the people in trouble are often, say, for instance, the news magazines, which I mean, it's hard to remember. The Time was founded It was an invention, really, Time, like the Reader's Digest. It was an invention. And the idea was to compartmentalize the news so that these busy executives could read it fast. And in the beginning, they didn't even have reporters. I mean, they just took from what they got from newspapers and the AP Wire and all that, put it in a easy-to-read, fast format, and invented actually some coverage that otherwise wasn't really being done right. Religion, medicine, things like that, the press. And maybe 20 years ago, Time briefly had a motto or an advertising slogan, "Make time for time." In other words, the opposite of the original intention of the magazine, because Time was then considered then a long read. It's like sort of, it became like Make Room for Proust or something like that, compared to the and you can actually, somebody somewhere, probably at some journalism school, keeps track of the sound bites of speeches run on television, and they've shrunk over the years. So these magazines that were really invented to save people time now are considered sort of a burden to read. So then they have to reinvent themselves some way or go under. I don't feel good about it, and I don't think anybody. At Time, it used to be called Church and State, that you didn't cross the line between church and state, although in fact you might argue that they did sometimes cross the line. At the New Yorker, one of the Fleischmans, Peter Fleischman, I think, who was then the owner of the New Yorker, or the family that owned the New Yorker, always said that he never, when he saw the editor in the elevator or in the hall or ran into him somewhere, he never complimented him on a piece, because that would imply that there were pieces he didn't like, or he did like and he thought it was none of his business. That if he didn't like what the editor was doing, he could hire another editor. I think, and in those days, for instance, the New Yorker never had a party. There was an annual anniversary party that we were told was the business department's party, and we were invited to it. But it wasn't our party. We didn't even have a Christmas party till the office boys finally started throwing a party themselves, which we were invited to. And maybe the management finally gave in and sent the office boys some scotch or something for their party. But basically, we didn't have parties. Well, now you have, I don't mean at the New Yorker, but in general, you have these people sponsoring things, having events that are really promotional things. I mean, there's been, in the last 15 or 20 years, a lot of blurring of or having, I mean, there was a piece in Columbia Journalism Review, 15 years ago, probably, showing how the covers of Vanity Fair matched the advertising of the fashion industry, and this is obviously not a good change for I mean, from the point of view of people like me. Well, part of that is simply the way that the role of alcohol has changed in our society. If you look at Mad Men, the series about advertising in the early 60s, that is indeed how people used to drink. And there weren't just reporters who drank that way. Everybody drank that way. We were talking about it the other day. I knew somebody from the Army. He was my commanding colonel in the Army, who had become a PR guy. And he had some story. He just needed to hand me a press release, really. We went to lunch and had, 3 or 4 martinis in order to do this, in order to make this handoff. That was quite common. And but that was true in the advertising business. It was true in practically certainly in New York. And and Jimmy Carter famously railed against the 2-martini lunch or 3-martini lunch, I can't remember, because on the expense accounts. But that was very common, and I think, on the other hand, I would agree with Gay that there was a connection between reporters and alcohol. It's hard to remember, but being a reporter is only lately a respectable occupation. And certainly, when I was a boy, I think a newspaper reporter, maybe there were a few exceptions like the White House or the Washington columnist for the New York Times or something, but basically it was thought of as a bunch of people in sort of greasy suits with folded up paper with these thick pencils and a bottle in the lower left-hand drawer. I remember a friend of mine saying once in Washington, this was early on in my career as a reporter, he had just spent a lot of time calling somebody's secretary, trying to find out what happened at some meeting that didn't make a whole lot of difference, and he knew the secretary was lying to him, and he knew when he finally got the guy on the phone, he would lie to him, and he would know that he was lying to him, and he would know that he would know he was lying to him. And he said, this is a guy who had, had a master's degree from Berkeley and a bachelor's degree from Yale and all that. And he said, is this a job for a college graduate? And the answer really was, not exactly. This is only lately, in the last, say, 30 years or so, that I think it's been thought of as a respectable occupation. And there was a lot of drinking. I think there's less now simply because people drink less, or they drink different things that don't seem to be as potent as the 3 martinis or the bottle in the drawer. But I think that's partly a societal change. I don't think it's just journalism. However, I do agree that the people who go into journalism now, and there have been, I think there was a piece by Maureen Dowd, since she wrote it with somebody else, I can't remember who, several years ago called The Nerds on the Bus or something like that. It was a reference to a famous book among journalists called The Boys on the Bus by Tim Krause, which followed the people who followed the presidential campaign. And this piece was basically about, these are different guys now. These guys have been to Harvard, and they have little machines to do things that the old guys on the bus never thought of, and they have families at home, and they tend to stay married to them for a while, and so they're a different group of people than used to be on the bus or covering things, and I think probably tend to drink less, partly because of their era and partly because of who they are. Well, I mean, I guess some of the most dramatic were very early on when I was in the South and spent a year in the South, and I was on the bus, the Freedom Ride bus that went in, the first bus that went into Jackson, and some of the I happened to be in the South in a very busy time. The South, the segregation story or integration story worked on plateaus because there was no real pressure from Washington. So not much had happened in the 6 months before I got there, but a lot happened in the year I was there. And there were 2 people for time then in the Southern Bureau. I replaced a guy who I think had left 6 or 8 months before. There just hadn't been anybody, and the bureau chief was married and had a few children, and to my astonishment, actually preferred to stay home rather than get chased by people with clubs in terrible places. I was delighted that he would let me do that, but I couldn't imagine why anybody would do that. I later learned that it was a more sensible way to lead your life. So I guess when I think of sort of dramatic moments, I think of the South. I was totally surprised by its closing, and although I've written for Gourmet, I wasn't ever a reader of Gourmet or of any other food magazine. I'm really not that interested in the subject, or actually not interested at all in the subject of food and cooking. And I don't cook, so the recipes were not of any use to me. But it was, as people have been saying since the announcement was made, it really was a sort of an icon, Gourmet. And I ran into a chef I know in my neighborhood yesterday, and he just said he was heartbroken by it. It was what they looked up to, and I guess Bon Appetit. I guess the theory that I only know what I read in the papers, that the theory was that Bon Appetit, owned by Condé Nast as well, was a sort of middle brow version, and that the decision was essentially Gourmet is for the elite, and this is for the middle class, and we'll go with these sort of people who like sort of kind of meat and potatoes recipes and need to cook at home and want to know about various things to save money and things. So, again, it's one of those financial decisions that for people who are actually doing the writing are always totally puzzling. Well, it's changed since the advent of the computer. I used to do some very specific drafts, starting out with sort of a pre-draft that was unfortunately referred to around the house as the vomit out. It was when I got home from the reporting, I would write a version of the piece without even looking at my notes. I think when I try to figure out what the purpose of the vomit out was, I think it was to see what kind of inventory what was in my mind, and also see what wouldn't work. I mean, which direction the piece had to go in or couldn't go in. And it started out in more or less English, but sort of disintegrated as I went. So I was always afraid when I wrote more at the New Yorker instead of at home. I was always afraid that some cleaning woman would find one of the vomit outs and entertain the other cleaning woman by reading it. And she'd say, "Oh, he calls himself a writer," and they would slap their brooms against the desks like hockey players. And I actually often didn't even look at it after I did it. The next day I would start for 15 years I did a piece around the country every 3 weeks for the New Yorker, and there was a day for each one of these drafts, and half of the rough draft the next day and half, and then something called the yellow draft that was different kind of paper, and then typing up. On the computer, and when I first started with the computer, I started more or less the same way. I used it as a fast typewriter. I would just print out the draft and then start over again, start actually typing it over again. Over the years, I finally got weaned from that, and now I guess what the people who know about computers would say is that I compose on the computer more than I did before. So I don't have any particular ritual or anything like that. I'm very sorry I don't have a complicated ritual. I always said no writer ever lost money taking himself too seriously. So I wish I could tell you that I stood on my head or something like that, but I don't. I just write whatever I have to write. Well, you can erase it with a typewriter too, in the sense that the draft doesn't have to. I used to just take it out of the typewriter and rip the page and staple it on and then staple the next place. So you can, I'm not so sure. I used to think that writing on a computer encouraged prolixity because you could sort of move whole sections instead of retyping them. But I think by now everybody's so accustomed to computers. My thought process was pretty much tied to the typewriter because I grew up in Kansas City, and you now occasionally read about cities running out of money and closing the schools, but Kansas City was way in the lead on this. It ran out of money when I was about in 8th grade and closed the school. And my father thought that kids shouldn't be out on the street in April or whatever it was. So he sent my sister and me to Sarashan Hooley Secretarial School. And then my sister was liberated then, which I've never understood that, because usually in that era, girls, it was thought that was one of the skills that would allow them to get work. But I was made to type every day for something. So consequently, my thoughts have always been sort of connected to typing. And there was a time when if I had to write something like a thank you note in longhand, I'd have to type it out first and then copy it. I mean, that isn't true of a lot of people. And now everybody types, even business people type. I think it was Fran Lebowitz said about men, isn't it amazing how fast they learn to type? They used to say before computers that, their big fingers wouldn't work and all that. Then they suddenly learned to type. Oh, small matters like whether the boiler guy is going to come and when he's supposed to get thing. And I'm not sure about. I usually go to sleep and then wake up and I'm thinking of these things. I'm not sure they wake me up, but once I'm up, I once gave a talk not long after 9/11 to some library people in Brooklyn. I mean, friends of the library in Brooklyn, or something like that. And someone said, "Are you concerned about flying after 9/11? You fly a lot." And I said, "Yeah. What concerns me is that you have to show your ID so much. I'm afraid I'll lose my driver's license." And you might say, I'm more afraid of the New York State Department of Motor Vehicles than I am of Arab terrorists. And a week or two later, I got a letter from somebody in the audience who said she knew of a very good psychiatrist who specialized in people who worried about small matters such as that. And I said, well, that actually was a joke, but sometimes I think I could use that guy.